Welcome to Business Insider's Ignition. Transportation, shifting gears, innovation ahead, presented by Arity. Here's our host, Senior Editor of Transportation for Business Insider, Alex Davies.
Hi, I'm Alex Davies. I'm a Senior Editor at Business Insider, where I oversee our transportation desk. I want to get things started with a little bit of fun this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, the joys of digital conferences. We are going to kick off with a polling question. So we've got a hypothetical here. And let's say that in a COVID-free future that we're all hoping and waiting for, your office reopens and now you have the right to work from an office instead of just from home. So if you have that option, would you go back in person? We've got three choices for you. You can go back as soon as humanly possible. You could say, wild horses could not drag me back to that office, leave me at home in my pajamas, or some kind of hybrid. I want the best of both. I want to be able to go in some days, stay at home other days. So please punch your answer in now, and we'll have the results in just a minute, and we can talk through those. In the meantime, I want to take a moment to thank Arity for helping put this together. They put a lot of work, support, and collaboration into this event, so thank you to them. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this digital version of Ignition Transportation. It's the first time I've gotten to do this event since coming back to Business Insider. I was here in my early days as a reporter, and it's really exciting to be back on this team. I was the original only transportation reporter back in 2012. I was the entire desk, and now I've got a team close to a dozen strong and growing, and I think that means we're really well positioned to cover this emerging world. So we've got a lot to go through today. In just a moment, we'll have our poll results here. Okay, so here are our answers. Probably not a huge surprise here. Just about 10% of you said you want to go back as soon as humanly possible. Maybe the home office is not the best place for you right now. Another 12% just have no desire whatsoever to go back. Wild horses could not drag you back to that office. And unsurprisingly, about 80% of you want some kind of hybrid. I think that makes sense. That's what I would go for. I think we've seen that there's certainly advantages to working from home, but I, for one, miss being in an office where I can actually see people and interact with them and don't have to spend like half the day dealing with the dog who wants attention. Okay, so that was the hypothetical. Here's the real. Just 2 weeks ago, the self-driving car company Waymo announced that it's starting to open its fully driverless cars to more members of the public in the Phoenix area. And that means that people who want to get from A to B, from Tempe to Chandler, Arizona, can do so in a car without a human behind the wheel, ready to take over, robot doing all of the driving. Meanwhile, Waymo's competitor Cruise announced that by the end of the year, it's going to be running completely driverless cars, what look like ghost cars, around the streets of San Francisco. And this is really exciting, right? This is the dream of autonomous transportation finally coming to fruition after like 15 years of really intense research from a whole raft of players. You hit a button, you pay a few bucks, a robot shows up, you get where you're going safely. That feels extra important now amid this pandemic, a pandemic that has changed how we move and changed how we think about the spaces we share with other people. It's also extra tricky now, though, right? Because all of a sudden, the question of safety isn't just, can this robot see that other car? Can it see that red light? Can it stop from crashing? All of a sudden, questions of safety now have to deal with, how do riders feel safe about their chances of contracting a really contagious virus? How does Waymo or Cruise or any of their competitors do contact tracing if someone does fall ill? How do they clean their vehicles? How do they test riders? Do they test riders? So these are all questions that we never really thought we would have to ask 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And now all of a sudden they're right at the forefront of this industry. So the pandemic then has made these technologies feel more important, but also maybe harder to execute or different to execute. And that same importance and that same question can go beyond self-driving cars. You can ask those questions about the drones that UPS is using to deliver medical supplies around cities, and the shared electric scooters and bikes that have popped up in cities, not just around the country, but around the world in the last few years. But the pandemic is just the newest, most recent, and most conspicuous reason to rethink how people and goods move around this planet. A rapidly changing climate is changing the importance of carbon emissions and making clear to us that we need to be burning less in terms of fossil fuels. Increasingly crowded cities are demanding smarter, more efficient, and more useful ways of getting around. New technology like drones and robot cars will definitely help here, especially if we use them in intelligent ways. But when you talk about remaking infrastructure, that's going to demand more than software changes. You can't fix every problem by swapping out zeros with ones and ones with zeros. If you want to connect cars, obliterate the internal combustion engine, curb emissions from air travel and ocean shipping, you have to plan decades out. You do need software, but you're also going to need policy changes. You're going to need to change hearts and minds, to borrow a phrase. You got to be ready to pour over new kinds of data, draft creative policies, build new things, and in some cases, write new software. You've got to be ready to do anything that will help us adapt to a world that has just made very clear, painfully clear, how very quickly everything can change, how quickly things can turn on their head. So today we've brought together a ton of great guests to discuss what those changes can look like and how we can make sure that we're making the right kinds of moves at the right time. We're going to talk to the head of UPS's Advanced Technologies Group. We've got General Motors' first Chief Sustainability Officer. We have the cycling advocate who went to Lyft be their head of micromobility and transit policy. We've got a lot of other great guests. If you have any questions today for our speakers, and I really hope you do, they're really smart people who come from really creative places, and I want this to be as interactive an event as possible. You can send those in using the Ask a Question function on the On24 platform. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first two guests onto the screen, if not onto the stage. We have Mira Joshi, who is a principal at urban design firm Sam Schwartz and the former chair and CEO of the New York City and Taxi and Limousine Commission, and Gary Hallegren, who's the president of mobility data firm Arity.
Hello.
Hi, Gary. Hi, Mira. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us. Good morning.
Yeah. So, Gary, let's start with you. I'm sure that not everyone will be familiar with Arity and, more importantly, with the kinds of data you collect. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What is your company? What kind of data do you have access to? And then let's just jump into what are you seeing in terms of driving? What are the broad strokes of how people are getting around right now?
Sure. So if we start with Arity, Arity's a mobility data and analytics company. So think of collecting driving information so that we can better understand transportation, make it safer, smarter, more useful for everybody. And we have a unique capability of identifying and quantifying risky driving. So we've been collecting data from mobile phones, from cars. We do that to serve a variety of industries, the insurance industry, automotive industry, but we collect a lot of data. We collect data from 23 million devices, and we collect that daily, ongoing, and in near real time for the most part. So we collect about 1 billion miles of driving data every 2 days. So it's a lot of data. As the pandemic hit, and I think that your comment in the opening was really, really striking, just how fast things could change. If we would have ever stood back and said that the whole, in a sense, country was going to virtually shut down or really pull it back that fast, you wouldn't have believed it was possible. But we saw that it actually was. Starting in the early part of March, and it literally started to happen over the course of a weekend as businesses started to shut down. We saw states by the end of March peak their driving down by as much as 70%. The range was 50 to 70%, average kind of around 60, varied in different areas, but it just really went off a cliff as you would expect. Everything was locked down. There really wasn't any place to go, and people were doing the right thing. We did a lot of analysis on how this trended versus the state lockdowns, when it was policy driven, when it was just kind of common sense driven inside of your area. And then we saw it to start to come back up, plateaued a little bit in July, and then continued to rise. So where we're at today is there are some states that are a little bit more, and there are some states that are still a bit less. And then a couple, like Hawaii is a good example, is still around 30% down in terms of their driving. So when you look at that data that way, that's the starting point from a macro standpoint. But if you dig into it a little bit deeper, it's like what really did change. And one of the things we've been doing a lot of research in recently was around the time of day driving. And what's interesting there is the morning commutes have pretty much really slowed down dramatically. They're still down 20-some percent across the country when you look at that. Evening commutes are starting to come back. The evening or the night weekend driving, when everything was closed down, it was down like 80% or so. And now that's starting to come back, but is still down quite a bit. So you think of your question of not wanting to go to work, and you think of that morning commute being light. There was a Bureau of Labor Statistics came out in September and said 20% of people are working remote, and you can see that in the highways. So the last point I'll mention is really what are we seeing as far as the driving behavior? So what does it mean? We know people are moving less, but what does it mean? The first thing is if you've been on the roads and you think you see people flying by you at 80 miles per hour or more, a lot more than before, you're right, and it's true that this is happening quite a bit. We're seeing like 15% more driving of that level of speed, and especially during that morning commute time. That's on the downside. Part of that, I think, is just because there's less cars on the road in the morning, so the traffic is flowing. The other part is we track driving behavior. You can think of it as aggressive driving. You can think of it as analytics that help us understand the riskiness and the likelihood of collisions, and that actually has been down. So we're seeing a trend down as far as that aggressive driving going. Again, possibly because there's a little bit less congestion. But what we're also then seeing on the flip side is because people are going faster when there is an incident, that it is very different from a severity standpoint, that the collisions tend to be a little bit worse. So we're seeing it more broadly, and then you really need to look regionally. And I think we're going to spend some time talking about urban versus rural a little bit later. But even if you look at the morning commute in Florida, where the schools are open, they're almost kind of back to normal. California, it's way down, like 30% down in the mornings because of that. So with that, I'll send it back to you. But it's interesting to see that data come to life and think about how to make different decisions based upon that.
And to build on that, Gary, do you see people coming back to work? Is there some kind of trend where you talked about seeing driving miles steadily rising? Do you expect that people will eventually end up driving back to work? Is this just a year-long, 2-year-long aberration in the data, or do you foresee some kind of permanent change or long-term change here?
It's such an interesting question. One of the things I've been saying since March is we're living in this grand experiment, and it's such an interesting experiment. I just wish we weren't all in it, because it's a very disconcerting thing to be in the middle of it. Personally, when we look at the amount of time that we all used to spend going back and forth to work and that unproductive time, I think that feeds into the 80% number that you got in the feedback of your poll. I liked in your intro that you talked about how it could affect emissions and could affect global warming by trying not to get the cars to be idling. We used to do a lot of fleet management and about a decade ago, and I think the stat was a mile of driving equals 6 minutes of idling. So the idea of having cars idling on the freeways is just horrible for the economy. So if we can keep them moving, it's a good thing. So personally, I don't know who's going to want to drive from, I live down in Orange County, California, from Orange County to LA anymore, or making that big long commute. So I do think there's going to be a change, but the data will tell us, that's for sure.
Mira, I want to bring you in here. Are you seeing that same kind of trend as someone who works on the policy of transportation planning? What are people in your circles thinking about that kind of change if, I mean, does the idea of rush hour cease to exist?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's certainly a question for, public transit agencies. Whereas, on March 13th, we were all, like sardines on a subway. That may be a thing of the past for a very long time, not because people don't necessarily have confidence and get back on public transit, but I think for the reason that Gary raised is we now have more control over the cadence of our work. And, do we need to honor a rush hour system if it's proven to be not necessary anymore? So we're certainly seeing that in a few different areas, which I'd like to highlight. One is obviously there was a real decline in use of public transportation, and that's slowly coming back. There was 80 to 90% drop in the use of taxis and Ubers and Lyfts in the city. And you see these sort of Uber and Lyft population coming back. They, at the high point in February, did about 750,000 rides a day, then went rapidly down to about 150,000 rides a day. And now, and that would be probably an April number, and now back up to about 450,000 rides a day. So still 300,000 rides off, which is a lot of riders, but that's a lot of change in a matter of months. And you see it in the real need for people to want to have options to get around. So new mobility was, already there and had a presence, but certainly boomed while the pandemic took grip of the city. Companies like Revel, which do a Vespa-style scooter, saw, an increase in subscription and an increase in daily usage, and they were able to expand to new parts of the city. Likewise, City Bike also saw an increase in usage, and they tied it with offers to incentives to essential workers to help them to get to and from places. But what it showed was people want options. They're still going to need to get around. If they're not comfortable in the subway, they're not comfortable in the bus. I think a lot of that is misinformation. It's not, actually, we did a report at Sam Schwartz showing that there is no link between COVID spread and public transit, but nonetheless, that happens. And they don't own cars. A lot of people in New York City don't own cars. Then these other options really take primacy and have a big role. So the final thing I want to talk about, actually two, it's related, is work from home and highways. Like talking about making decisions about long-term infrastructure changes. Is this now a time where we take a second look at what we have on the table for highway development? How many lanes do we need now? What if a certain percentage of people won't be on the highway going to work anymore? So can can states actually save considerable amount of capital funds by reassessing what their highway structure plans are? We found in New York State that was certainly true, and the state has made adjustments on what they plan to spend, decreasing the number of lanes in planned highways. But on congestion, I think, you raise an interesting point, Gary, when you talk about like the levels are coming back, right? And they are really coming back and almost to the point of going beyond. So in New York City, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which connects Brooklyn to Manhattan, and it's not cheap to go through either, I might mention. It's the rate of people using that option is actually 14% higher in September 2020 than it was in September 2019. So I think that's like an incredibly telling data point. It shows us there are people of a certain means that are opting not to take public transit, but yet they are still opting to come into Manhattan. So there is a lot for us to learn, and I think a lot for us to really absorb quickly to make intentional policies to sort of change or give people different incentives to make different decisions, because we certainly don't want a world where we get out of a pandemic only to find we're in an overly congested, highly polluted and an environment where people are driving maybe more fast and more aggressively. So we could switch one evil for the other if we're not careful about how we plan using this information.
It's such an interesting that I mentioned the grand experiment that then when you allude to those different modes of transportation with the highways. The out of school, I spent time being a civil engineer, so worked in the design of highways, and the federal government was making sure that every freeway had a carpool lane on it on the interstate, so that people would start to carpool, and it did work. And as congestion drove, it did work in that way. But nothing has changed driving like what we just have experienced here. But to Mira's point, then, so now I'm going to drive a little bit more and I'm going to overdo the tunnels. And I think the transportation system is it's so fickle that it doesn't take much to, one, have there be a little bit less ridership or less cars so where it flows freely, or that to overload it and all of a sudden it becomes a really big problem. So I think this, as we start to work through, as people come back to normal, it's a challenge because the federal government or any government trying to plan these roads, you're planning a decade at a time, and how to predict that is going to be challenging for everybody.
Mira, we've got a question here from the audience from SAS Press of iSun Energy. They ask that, budgets are being challenged everywhere. Do you see any new business models through which citizens can be incentivized to avoid rush hours? And I would build on that. Do you see maybe new budget tools that cities can be using to influence how people maybe avoid driving altogether?
Yeah, and I think it's a circle, and it can be a rewarding circle or it can be a vicious circle. So in terms of tools, one of the tools which was to be implemented in New York City and is now on hold in the federal government is congestion pricing. And that would be the first city, I think, in the nation to employ congestion pricing. And that's a means of disincentivizing people, raising the price so that it's not worth it to bring your car into Midtown Manhattan. But it has to be rewarded on the other side, which is that you are giving the public a viable option that works. And that is investment in public transit that's increased. I think, buses are having a heyday. So increasing bus service, which is one of the leaner ways we can make effective changes in public transit, and making sure you have the infrastructure to support these new modes. So there are bridges that are now crowded with bikes and scooters and pedestrians. So we've actually throttled that population. Maybe even more people would be taking bikes and scooters and using their feet if bridges had more capacity. So thinking about ways to structure not just cities, I think this is also sort of a suburban and a more local community concern too. How do we make sure there's enough space for those people that are choosing not to take cars? And then there's countless ways that companies that offer new mobility can engage with business, can engage with employers to provide incentive programs to really think about how to get more people involved in using what they have to offer. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and a lot of these services come to cities knowing that they're operating in the city should not cost the city anything, and that the fees that the city charges should offset the costs of management. So that's actually, not something I think you'd find 10 years ago. There'd be an assumption that, we can operate on the street just like everybody else. I think there's really been a shift in mindset, and I think it's a good financial shift in mindset that happened a little bit pre-COVID and has certainly taken a much firmer grip since COVID, that this cannot be a partnership where cities provide all the infrastructure and companies coming in to use it don't provide anything. There's really much more of a fee sharing attitude towards it.
And how many companies before they did? How many companies before they did the survey that we're doing now that said how many people would want to work partially remotely? It wouldn't have, that number wouldn't have been nearly as high, and businesses wouldn't have allowed it. And now I think when everyone starts getting your data back saying that 70% of my employees want to work differently, I think the businesses they're going to accommodate it. And as they start to accommodate it, then even just a little bit of a move towards congestion pricing probably has a disproportional benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we can see not just ideas like congestion pricing, but maybe more flexible congestion pricing, dynamic pricing that changes and that gives city planners more tools to keep everything flowing smoothly on their roads. Gary, I want to ask you to build a little bit on on Mira's point that we shouldn't just be talking about cities here, we should be talking about suburbs and rural areas. Can you walk us through some of the big trends you're seeing in terms of driving patterns? Are the suburbs looking really different from cities for less populated areas?
It was dramatic. It literally was dramatic as we started to see these states. We have graphs that I think are on. I think they're probably still on the website from of our old webinars. But there was a trend where all of the states took a same curve where you started with what normal was in March, and it just all went down. They went down in the same shape, but they went down disproportionately. I mentioned some of the states were down 70% and others down 50%. And as they've come back, they still have that 20% spread. We started to look at that more from a state by state view, but what we started to realize that states like Wyoming or maybe Colorado or other ones in the West and the Southwest where there's more space, they tended to be the ones where people were actually driving more. Their reduction was less. So we started to dig things down at the county level. The good thing about having the data set that we have is we can almost get down to a zip code level of data and start to do these trends. But from a county level, we saw dramatic things that just if you got a little bit outside of Atlanta, you looked a whole lot more like South Dakota or Wyoming than you did if from just the county right next door. We always look at Washington, D.C. as a separate entity, and that was always one of the most restrictive, where people restricted their travel the most. But yet, if we compared that to New York or Chicago or San Francisco, it actually was quite the same. When we saw it come back, we saw those areas come back much in the same way as well. And now the rural areas, or the more, I guess, less dense areas, just generally the way that we look at it, those areas are driving more. And in the cities, it's still, there's a lot of people making other choices. And largely, as Mira mentioned, it's because you can. I can jump a scooter. I can take transit. Whereas if you need to get 20 miles to the Home Depot, you're going to have to drive.
Mira, here's another question from the audience for you, and I think it builds off what Gary was just talking about. Do you see mobility as a service options, the kind of service that would interconnect mobility platforms, public transit, maybe park and ride, micro-mobility? Do you see, what are the prospects for those in suburban and urban areas? Do you think those will pick up in popularity going forward?
So I think of that as sort of the giving the customer or the passenger as much information as possible. So it's ideal if you're a consumer, if you can go to one place and see what all your options are, what the speed is of each one, and what the price is of each one, and you can make an informed decision, then that's ideal for consumers. I think some of the sticking points here in the United States, it's been more successful in European countries, is that we don't have the sort of data sharing and the being able to interconnect the way they do. And so you have a lot of these services, but they may not be showing the consumer the full picture. And I think that's sort of like a bad midpoint, because it can skew consumer choice one way or another. And that may be a matter of, having better regulation around requirements about sharing data. But there are places, and I'll use the city example just because that's what I tend to be most familiar with, where if you look at something and you see, if I take a rideshare option, it's X amount of money and takes this amount of time. If I take public transit, it's a lot cheaper and maybe it's 5 minutes less, or maybe it's only 5 minutes more. I may make a different decision. Had I not had that side-by-side comparison, I might have gone with what I usually do. And maybe what you usually do is not something we want to, as a community, we're better off giving people the information. They're not able to make the best decisions. So I'm a big proponent of that. And I think that consumers would really benefit. I think public policy would really benefit because it could support smart choices. But I do think it takes a certain amount of teeth from regulators and local government to require that all of the options out there are sharing the same data, and in a format that app generators can use, and so that the customers can actually see it.
That's such a great point. It's a great point from the standpoint of the consumer, but also from the utilities as well, and from the departments of transportation, because if they're only looking at one side of the equation and not seeing what's happening with scooters or not seeing what's happening with Lyft and Uber, they're also going to make bad choices or not the most accurate choices.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, I'm sorry to say we've got to wrap it up here. I want to thank you very much, Gary. Thank you for joining us, Mira. Maybe we're not going back to our offices anymore, but certainly we're going to keep moving, and we've got to figure out ways to keep all of that going slowly. So thanks to both of you for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel Premack.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Premack. I am a senior transportation reporter at Business Insider. And today we have Bala Ganesh from UPS. He's the head of their advanced technology group, rather. And he joined UPS in 2012 and in another role, but he quickly became sort of the go-to guy at UPS for all things drone delivery. And my first question, Bala, we've been hearing about drones for years and years and years. We've seen, even Domino's deliver a pizza via drone. But when we're getting packages normally, it is coming just on your standard, often a UPS truck. Where are drones, and when are they going to become, the normal way that we get our packages?
So, as you mentioned, so we started down this journey almost 3 or 4 years ago. And what we've been in so far has been a test and learn journey, not just us, but everybody that you mentioned. And so what we are right now in the process of, as we work through with the integration pilot program with the FAA, is turn the corner and get to a more sustainable operation. Now, we consider drone to be one of the modes for us to serve our customers. Now, we use a variety of technologies, including vehicles, cars, e-bikes, and everything in between to deliver packages to our customers. And we believe that for the right customers, for the right requirements, user needs, and the willingness to pay, this will fit into that portfolio of technologies that we bring to the table.
So one of the interesting things about UPS's take on drone delivery is that you started really working first in the medical field, whether it was overseas and increasingly in the US. UPS is getting more and more involved in moving crucial medical supplies via drone. And obviously that initial investment in medical has become even more crucial and even more relevant in the past 6 months with COVID. But I'm wondering, has COVID forced UPS to pivot its exploration of drone technology and drone delivery now that medical has just become even more crucial?
So absolutely, there's a variety of things we work on, right? So when we work on technologies, it's not just technology for technology's sake. We try to match it with the right customer use case and needs. And from our perspective, the initial step for drones would be in this critical healthcare / other industries that really require something urgently. And that's where we started off from. Now, in the future, as the technology becomes more mature and the costs go down, it could potentially meet other use cases. Now, getting to the C19 as such and focusing on that, we definitely see a call to action with drones and other technologies too, to meet those needs for those customers. As we moved forward after the pandemic started playing out in the US, we've done a couple of very interesting tests and starting to now move that forward into more sustainable operations. So we have, first of all, started moving COVID-related movements within our campus model at Big Forest Baptist. And then the second is we moved to start delivering in partnership with CBS to the villages, which is the largest retirement community. And both of those was in very close collaboration with the FAA that worked with us to offer us these options for COVID-related tests and use cases. Now, while drones also is a big priority for us, as part of the Advanced Technology Group, we also bring a variety of other technologies to meet those customer needs, including one of the most critical things that we are starting to ramp up substantially and starting to see substantial traction in the short term in the market is sensors. So as these vaccines move across the globe, being kept at a certain temperature becomes important. We are starting to apply that a lot in moving those vaccines safely into the U.S. As we start moving into next year. So it's not just this, but I think we're going to see a variety of technologies start playing a role in creating that future where perhaps you may need more personalized medicine, more non-contact based deliveries and movements, and more automation as we move forward.
Yeah, that's one of the things that that you always emphasize and talk about when we have our interviews, which seem to be almost multiple times a quarter because there's always something new going on with UPS's technology group. I'm wondering, so the other big advance that I know your group has been really invested in is that $3 billion that UPS has committed to improving its sortation and these sorts of other technologies. What sort of impact and what sort of advances are you already seeing from that $3 billion spend?
So that's a big push that we've been making over the last few years. And the focus was that we wanted to have fewer touches in the system, and then actually being our operations being automated. And currently, almost 90% of the packages now move through automated buildings. So the idea is to not only make it more efficient, but as the demographics evolve, having a different kind of work structure who are working on different, more interesting work potentially may happen out in the future. So automation is playing a big role for us, first of all, to improve our efficiencies, and number two, to make sure that we can serve our customer need better by making the what we call the network or the buildings and how we move the packages more efficient. So that's been a big push over the last few years, and now we're starting to see the benefits of that, both from an efficiency, flexibility, and a cost perspective.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the big challenges that UPS is really facing head on or taking on head on is this issue of, people want their packages faster, but they also don't want to pay a ton for free shipping, or they don't want to pay a ton for that shipping. So looking at different, like investing in that technology, in that automation, is a great way to meet halfway. The packages get there quickly, but they also we're also still fitting into the consumer demand and interest into free shipping. So we've got sensors, we've got automated warehouses, we've got drones. What else should we look out for that's becoming the way that we're getting our packages more and more?
So one of the big things that's not very visible that we spend a lot of time and effort on is algorithmic work. So basically work to make things more efficient in the network. So which is basically what we call our smart logistics network. And the idea is that by collecting all the data into the cloud, into the UPS cloud, of all this data that we get from, we are able to make smarter choices. And we are working on two kinds of algorithms. So optimization algorithms, and of course, machine learning based algorithms. And we're doing a variety of work to make our network more efficient. So one example that you hear a lot about is, of course, our final mile optimization we call Orion, which has been being deployed for the last 10 years or so. And recently, we just upgraded to Orion 3.0, which not only is much more dynamic, but also is able to react to different conditions like traffic, et cetera, and make best smarter choices. The other one we are investing is our network. So when we talk about, just to kind of give you all an orientation of how it works, right? So when you move something, let's say from Los Angeles to New York, it is picked up by a vehicle that looks like what you see at your home, typically, or it could be from a trailer, picked up by a trailer, and then it's moved in these trailers all the way through some hubs to, let's say, Brooklyn Center, and then finally the package car, which you see outside your home, delivers it. So when I talk about Orion, it is the first and final mile that is being optimized, and then we have something called network planning tools, or NPT, that is optimizing all the in between, all those tractor trailer moves that are taking it across the country, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The big projects we're working on. And the impact you see is in how efficiently that package can move from one end of the country or world to the other end.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I find interesting about covering UPS is that the company is obviously very focused on these advanced technologies, drones and sensors and so on and so forth. But a lot of the present day advances that we're seeing day to day from UPS would be Orion. I kind of think of it as like a super Google Maps. Basically, it's delivery drivers I can imagine have millions of different ways to do their dozens of stops per day in a city or in a suburb. And Orion finds the most efficient way to do those stops. And if you look at the traveling salesman Wikipedia page, it's very complicated. So I am very deeply impressed by Orion by sorting that out. But I would be remiss to not ask a little bit more about drones because that's always the hot topic. I'm curious, how do you think drones look like once we get to the point in which they are a common delivery tactic? I remember you told me before that we're obviously not going to see drones in a place like Brooklyn where there's well, I don't want to say skyscrapers. I'm not going to be that nice to Brooklyn, but we'll see them mostly in rural areas, it seems, or we'll see drones deliver even to individual vans. Can you walk us through a little bit like how you envision that?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, it is just one arrow in our quiver of technologies that we use to get that package to you in the most efficient way. And I talked about how typically, as of now, it is the per customer with the urgent need that requires that technology right now. So when we talk about the future, for example, likely, and I'm kind of speculating here, so take it for what it's worth. Uh, the likely it may initially play a role more in the suburban or rural areas. So one of the models that we've tested in the past is what we call the driver assist model. So which is, imagine a super rural kind of location. The driver may be driving 2 to 3 miles for a stop. And imagine if a drone can take off from the top and then make another stop 2 to 3 miles away and meet that driver in the next stop. Now you made that driver really productive and made the environment more efficient because now you've cut down on emissions, et cetera, because you have an efficient stop that's being completed. So there are certain limitations you have to keep in mind. One is, of course, we still have to solve for really urban areas. And now there's a lot of ideas. I'm sure that time will come when we think about it, but it may not be in the medium term. And then the other point, of course, is at least the way we are thinking about it today, they have certain limitations of payload. Now, while a certain percentage of the stops or the packages can be handled by those, it is only a small percentage of the total number of stops that need to be made or the total number of packages that need to be delivered. So I think it'll have a fit in certain areas and certain packages, and potentially as a driver assist or as a driver improvement model. And I think it's going to be interesting over time to see how that evolves as the technology becomes more mature.
Okay, that makes sense, and it's also interesting to note or important to note that, which I didn't really understand before I started in this on this beat, is that it costs more usually to deliver a package to a rural area than to an urban area. There's more driving. There's just a lot more time involved when you're delivering to a house in the middle of the prairie versus an apartment building or an office building where you can make multiple stops with just one parking location. And then, so we've got just a minute left of our interview today. I wanted to ask if you could walk us through maybe what are some specific use cases you see for the drone, and once we have the vaccine, like how do you see those two technologies coming together?
Absolutely. So, and again, I'll make the caveat that because we'll have to march in line with the regulators and their comfort and how we move forward as far as like regulations are concerned. Now, that would be so one of the use cases that would be a really good fit is when you need really urgent, life-saving things to be moved, and it's often better and more efficient to store it at a central location. And vaccines are really expensive. Implants, infusion drugs, those kind of things perfectly fit that model. It typically requires to be stored at a very managed or very closely contained temperature range, and therefore is way more efficient to store it at a central location. And so, but at the same time, you need it urgently when somebody needs it. So something like a drone technology would be a perfect fit, which we're using right now in North Carolina in a couple of hospitals, because it does just to give you a little bit of insight, just in a campus environment, which is just a couple of miles radius, just buildings being moved, things being moved within that couple of miles radius. Things that used to take 30 to 60 minutes with a courier in a car who was on demand would be called to move things. Now takes 5 to 10 minutes because while the person may be occupied somewhere else, there may be congestion, etc. Now you have an on-demand technology that's able to fly as the crow flies, point to point, to move those things. So there's a substantial change in how we can potentially make life-saving improvements in healthcare. Then the second thing I'll mention is it also has a substantial impact in the sustainability aspect. Imagine a courier that's driving car around in the hospital environment is not a most optimal scenario compared to a drone that is electrically powered and is able to fly directly between the buildings. So this is just a very small example today what's happening in a 2-mile kind of radius healthcare campus network. Potentially, now you can extrapolate that as we're able to fly longer distances. It's going to be a lot more efficient because you could store things at a regional central location and moved as needed.
Well, that's really, really exciting stuff. Very impactful, life-saving, incredible stuff that UPS is working on. As our other leading medical minds hopefully make some progress on this vaccine and hopefully get us all back to a normal kind of society. But thank you so much, Bala, for sharing your experience with us today. And thank you to the audience for joining us too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Bala, for joining us today. The idea of having fewer touch points definitely sounds like a good idea right now, even if it's not exactly the kind of touch points that we think about with this virus. Before I welcome our next guest, we've got another poll question for everyone in the audience, and I'm going to ask you, out of the following choices, which do you consider to be the most important priority for policymakers right now? Should they be looking at road safety, zero carbon emissions, infrastructure improvements, or equitable transportation? So please get your answers in, and we can go over the results in just a minute. In the meantime, as a reminder, if you have questions, you can submit them using the Ask a Question function on the On24 platform. We had a lot of great questions in our first panel. I'm sorry to say we couldn't get to all of them. We're trying to get to as many as we can, and not just because it makes my job as moderator easier, but it's we want to keep this as interactive an experience as possible, even if we're stuck doing this digitally, at least for now. So again, our question here is, out of these choices, which do you consider to be the most important policy? Road safety, zero carbon emissions, infrastructure improvements, or equitable transportation? So we've got our answers in. Pretty even split between road safety and zero carbon emissions, both just around 20%. Equitable transportation, not so much, 8.3%. And more than half of you think that infrastructure improvements are the most important policy priority. So that tees us up nicely for this session, in which we are going to talk to Dane Parker, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at General Motors, and Allison Malik, the Executive Director at SAFE, which works to enhance energy security and support economic resurgence and resiliency by advancing transformative transportation and mobility technologies. Allison and Dane, thanks very much for joining us. Dane, let's start with you. Let's start with you, Dane, Chief Sustainability Officer at General Motors. If I'm right, that's a new position. So what do you do? What do you do for General Motors?
It is a new position. It certainly isn't a new effort for the company. And I think I do a lot of connecting internally and externally on the efforts we make so that people can see they align, that they can align. And then I help make sure that all of the various areas in which we do work that is sustainability related, which varies from people and community to product and infrastructure, that we tie all those well together into our story, and that employees, ultimately my goal is that every single employee see the role they play as an individual and what they can do differently in their job.
Got it. Allison, I want to ask you a little bit about SAFE. And I think when we talk about cars, we can understand the idea of safety. But when we talk about economic opportunity, I feel like maybe some people in our audience will think, well, sure, there's economic opportunity for the automakers, but is it broader than that as we try and make this shift away from internal combustion?
Yeah, so with SAFE, as you discussed, we focus on how we can advance the interests of everyone as we think about transportation. It started more in energy, but as we look at how transportation impacts every part of people's lives, we realize that there's a lot of different aspects that we can dive into. And as we think about economic opportunity and accessibility, the project that I am heading up for SAFE, which is the Commission on the Future of Mobility, is actually looking at that in conjunction with safety and energy efficiency. How can we pull all of those things together? Because we need all of them in order for our transportation systems to be successful. And so when we think about, if we go green, that's great. If we leave a lot of people without jobs or with access to vehicles that are too expensive, then we're going to continue to exacerbate issues around people's ability to get themselves to their own jobs or their ability to participate in the economy, get to school, get to the doctor's office. And so when we think about what's important, the commission in particular is focused on how do we keep all of these things at the forefront, not only because they're all important, but if we can find solutions that actually work across all of these topics, we'll be able to drive for better outcomes.
Got it. So building off that for a moment, Allison, what do you see as the real barriers to electric car ownership for people?
So I am the executive director at SAFE, but I actually worked in EV charging for a long time as an engineer. And it's interesting now, almost 15 years on, that EV charging is still a big barrier. As we think about the initial ownership and purchase price of the vehicle, that can keep a majority of people out of the market. But with the recent announcements in states like California that by 2035, all of the vehicles sold need to be electric, there's going to be a push. They have to have electric vehicles available for sale. So when we think about this, the next question is, how can we make sure that everybody can fuel the vehicles? And with EV charging and that many fully electric vehicles, that will be a big draw on the grid. It doesn't mean that we can't manage that. We've got 15 years to figure it out. But it does mean that we need to get started now, thinking about how do we make sure that there's enough distribution of the energy, that there are the right business models to supply charging, not just at home, but also in public, and thinking about people that live in homes that maybe don't have garages, or they have shared garages and things like that, and things like apartments. We need to make sure that that infrastructure is available for people so that way when they purchase the vehicle, they've got the whole experience covered.
I'm actually super excited. I'm about to move from my apartment building into a house, and I'll be able to charge my plug-in hybrid at home instead of just at the grocery store or the gym. Dane, what's the role of General Motors and other automakers in making it easier for people to buy and to own and to use electric cars?
And Allison touched on, I think, two of the three key enablers because ultimately people first need a vehicle that they want, that they can afford. And as Allison said, we can't leave people behind, so we can't have vehicles in just one segment of the market. And so one of the important roles we play as a manufacturer is that will provide vehicles in all segments of the market so people can find something they want that has the range that they can be comfortable with as a primary vehicle. And I think that's also important. Many early vehicles didn't have a range that gave people the confidence that could be their only vehicle. And that's obviously changing very quickly. And so we'll provide vehicles that give them the choice they want, the range they want. And then, as Allison mentioned, the last obstacle is charging. And we find that over 80% of the people charge primarily at home. Another 10% of the charging happens at work, and to a lesser degree happens in these public areas, but those become increasingly important for access. So we don't have these charging deserts in areas that, especially urban areas where people live in higher density housing, they need to be able to charge a vehicle or have options for that for it to be a viable solution for them. So I think as we make progress in all three of those areas, we'll see adoption speed up very quickly.
And Dane, to build off of that, what are the changes that General Motors would like to see happen that maybe aren't the purview necessarily of an automaker with regard to what Allison touched on, which is any changes we might need to see to the grid? Is if everyone is all of a sudden plugging their cars in the middle of the day, are we going to see blackouts? How do we avoid that kind of problem?
Yeah, clearly the grid is going to be a very important element in moving to this zero emissions, all electric future. And there's two elements I think that are going to be important in the grid. One is the source of energy for that as we continue to green the grid. Clearly electric vehicles directly don't have traditional tailpipe emissions, but it's important that the grid continue the progress to be a lower carbon grid. And dealing with that by itself is a challenge. The intermittency that some renewable sources bring, like wind and solar, will require some new solutions in storage and grid management. I think the technology to manage the grid, which has been very old and is in need of some updates and opportunities there, will help manage that intermittency. And then, as you mentioned, when and how people charge will be important. Now, the good news in that actually is that if people charge at home, they'll often be charging or be able to charge during off-peak hours, and balance some of the demand that falls off in the evenings when there's very little demand often. And so I think with vehicles and chargers being smarter and smarter, and the grid being smarter, if we can invest in technology to have a smarter grid, we'll end up with a solution that I think will be a win-win for those driving as well as those operating and managing the loads.
Allison, who do you think, who are the key players in making those kinds of changes happen? What's the role of automakers, or is this really up to policymakers in places like California or the utilities? How do we make sure that the changes we need to happen are happening with the grid?
Well, a lot of this comes down to looking at electrified vehicles as an ecosystem. So it needs the automakers to be able to come out and point out that even if the product is there, if we don't have charging, we won't be able to be successful in this transition. So I think in this case, having the automakers at the table, we've already got good charging standards for passenger vehicles, so that's great. There can be unified infrastructure, but helping to help more policymakers understand the need for this ahead of a a full transition of the fleet. So that way it helps them to understand why they need to start thinking about the policy that exists around utilities. The utility commissions can start to think about, does it make sense for the utilities to take this on, specifically for the consumer interface, or are there other companies that need to be partnered with to be able to make sure that this infrastructure will be ready? It really will take all parties coming together, because you need to make sure you're understanding the challenges of each group. I think at this point, OEMs, so automakers are bought in. The future is electric, which is great. And so continuing to communicate on that is really important, again, to help policymakers understand once the vehicles are there, we need to have the infrastructure. And the automakers alone can't make that happen. There needs to be the power generation, the distribution, but again, that consumer interface needs to be there for charging as well. So it's going to need to be a group effort.
All right. And Allison, I want to ask you a little bit more about safety. That's one of our topics today. It's right there in your organization's name. I don't think people necessarily connect the idea of electric cars with safety. Maybe when we talk about a future of autonomous cars that don't crash, that idea is a little bit more there. But can you connect those dots for us? How does safety work into your organization's goals?
Yeah, so when we think about transportation, a lot of us worry about we think about electric vehicles in that transition in part because of the impact that vehicles have on the environment and that demand for energy. If we are all driving electric vehicles and continue at the same rate of traffic and crashes that we had pre-COVID, so when we think about that type of rush hour traffic and things like that, there's still a lot of energy that gets wasted. And none of us want that. So even if you have an electric vehicle, if you're parked in traffic, you're still using up energy that's not moving you forward. And this is where that interplay between safety and efficiency becomes really important. And that's a big focus for us at SAFE. SAFE is focused on trying to work on diversifying all types of fuel into vehicles. And a big part of that is just reducing the utilization. So if there's fewer crashes, there can be fewer backups, and if there's fewer backups, there's less energy going to just holding your car on the freeway. That's the most simple example, but it helps people to realize that as we think about vehicles as a part, again, of that ecosystem, we can actually come up with some pretty elegant solutions to help, again, we could improve safety and efficiency through technologies, even like level 2 safety systems that just prevent you from crashing into a car ahead of you. Those types of things can impact, like I said, both safety and energy efficiency.
Right. Level 2 autonomous driving systems, things like Tesla Autopilot, Cadillac Super Cruise, that they kind of keep the car in its lane and away from the vehicle in front of you. Here's a question from the audience, and Dane, I'd love for you to take this one on. What's your estimated mix of propulsion systems in new vehicles sold in 2025, so 5 years out? What kind of mix do you expect to see? Hybrids, pure internal combustion, battery hybrids, fuel cell powered?
Yeah, and that's a question that we get asked a lot. And of course, any answer for that will be wrong, because none of us know exactly what will happen in 2025. We've stated publicly as a company we expect to sell 1 million EVs in our major markets globally by 2025. And from a percentage basis, every quarter, the last several quarters, most people who put forth estimates have upped their estimates of this transition from EVs or from ICE vehicles to pure EVs. And you see estimates now in mid-century as high as 10 or 15%. I would say that what I would see is I think we'll see a faster transition to pure EVs. Hybrids bring a lot of the complexities of a combustion engine and of a battery electric propulsion system, and they still have a combustion engine. And so I think we'll see more and more investments into pure battery electric vehicles. And as the price curve continues to improve for batteries in the next 2 to 3 years, I think that will help. 25 will be, I think, about the inflection point, and we'll start to see accelerations after that.
All right. Allison, here's an audience question for you. Are Are there any thoughts or serious efforts to use electric cars and their batteries as ways of redistributing energy and proactively load balancing? I guess this would be like vehicle to grid power transfer.
Yeah, so there are discussions looking at how we could use vehicle to grid transfer. Again, that means the vehicles can take in energy when it's being generated. Great system to use with renewable energy so that we can grab that solar energy during the day and send it back out on the grid when you need it, maybe later at night. This is being explored more heavily when you look at large fleets. So think buses and big trucks. They generally have bigger batteries and there's more vehicles. So you can get a meaningful impact on the grid of that number of vehicles actually supplying the energy back. They can also, from a corporate perspective, it's a little bit easier to set up those relationships with the local utility to make sure you've got the right kind of net metering and things of that nature. So I think there's exciting progress. And another area of opportunity is actually looking at battery second use. So when batteries come out of electric vehicles, they still have a lot of useful capacity left. They may just not be able to fully accelerate like you would be used to on the highway. And in that case, you can actually take the batteries out of the vehicle and use them as a stationary storage for the grid as well. And I think that that's an area where there are a couple of pilots going on, and it will be an exciting area of growth as more and more EVs are on the road.
Good. Dane, we've got just a minute left, not even that, but I'm interested in hearing what's General Motors' take. Is this some kind of technology that you think would work in GM vehicles or that you're interested in pursuing?
Simple answer is yes. And I think in the next several weeks, we'll have some announcements that show some of the innovative things that can be done with the technology. So the vehicles, EVs are smart enough now to manage that themselves. And we do feel like we have great relationships with several utility providers and some of the independent distributors. And we believe absolutely that's an important opportunity for partnerships and some new business models as well.
All right. All right. Well, thanks very much, Dane. And thanks, Allison, for joining us. And Dane, you didn't slip it in there. I'll do it for you, that the all-electric Hummer is being revealed tonight. So we're excited to see that.
Thank you. You saved me. I would have gotten in trouble if I didn't mention that.
Happy to do it. And Allison, thanks for walking us through the work that SAFE is doing. I'd now like to kick it back to my colleague, Rachel Premack, who has a pair of back-to-back interviews for us.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining us once again. My name is Rachel Premack. I'm a senior transportation reporter at Business Insider. And today we're very lucky to be talking with Daniel Chu, who is the Chief Product Officer at Waymo. And it's a kind of coincidental and that we're talking to Daniel right now because Waymo actually just had a huge product announcement. They are now offering 100% totally driverless taxis in Phoenix, which is a major advancement. So, Daniel, how did Waymo get to this stage, and what are some of the lessons that you're already learning from this product, from this offering?
Yeah, definitely excited about the announcement that we had on October 8th around offering fully driverless rides for our Waymo One ride service. That's our commercial ride-hailing service. Yeah, I agree. Definitely, it's been a path and a journey here. So we've been looking at self-driving for over 10 years now. We had our first self-driving ride in 2015. And even last year, we've taken basically incremental steps, is I think the answer to the question. And so last year in 2019, we started offering driverless rides to a program we call the Early Rider Program. That's basically a trusted tester cohort of ours that give us great feedback around understanding self-driving cars and how they interact with them. And so that's been the path, is kind of every few years kind of increasing the increments and offering something more compelling to our riders. And so very excited about that announcement. In terms of what we've learned, I think there's been a mix of technical and product learnings over the years. So on the technical side, I think some examples, it's reinforced some approaches that we've taken. So for instance, we take we'll call a full stack approach. We do everything from sensors to mapping to behavior and perception. And it's allowed us to quickly iterate on the product and understand that there's interdependencies amongst these elements. Another example is it's reinforced the notion that it's really important for us to both have a very robust simulation stack, which we've invested from the beginning, as well as real world models. And we do a combination of the two. On the product side, it's been really amazing to learn from our riders in our early rider program and understanding their feedback. We've learned things, for instance, around, hey, some things like pickup and drop-offs are really important interactions that are different when it's with a self-driving car. And we've also learned around how do we build trust with our riders. So we've invested a lot in our user interfaces to make it very clear to the riders what is the car thinking and doing. But I think most relevant to the recent launch is we've also really reinforced the notion that fully driverless is an entirely new ballgame. We see that in terms of the reaction of our riders. They're very excited when they get these fully driverless rides. And also it creates a host of things that we need to think through to make sure it's the best product. So I think it's been a mix of product and technical learnings over the last few years.
So what is that like if you go into a totally driverless taxi? No one's in it. What is that pickup and drop off experience like?
Yeah, so it starts from our mobile app. That's really kind of how people interact with us. You let us know where you want to get picked up, and you'll see the Chrysler Pacifica come up to the curb, and then you open the door. It will welcome you in terms of the user interface. Gives you some confirms that you're the person that hailed the ride and gives a sense of where you're headed. Within the user interface itself, it also allows you to choose, right? So you can have different views. You can have a map view. You can also have just a sense of what the car is doing. So that's the view that I was talking about before, where it really gives you a sense of what the car is seeing. If it's like braking or making a pause, it gives a sense of why it's doing that. So that's really kind of the experience. You've got within the Pacifica, we've also heard from our riders that sometimes there's families, sometimes there's younger folks. So we actually have car seats in the car. There's 2 car seats in the car, allow families to use it. And then you're off to the races. You basically let the car know you're ready to go, and it takes you there. Along the way, there's different features you can use, but really that's what it is. That gives you that privacy, that space to yourself. That's what our riders really rave about.
What in exploring this offering in Phoenix and in other cities, what have you been noticing are the big two, or rather, have you noticed that it's more challenging to work through the technology challenges, or more challenging to look at how to work with regulators and local laws? I'm interested in this just because I'm from the Detroit area, where there's been, of course, a lot of self-driving progress, and regulators and the government are really interested in opening Michigan up to this sort of experimentation. But then you do have the technological challenges, especially the weather challenges. So yeah, I'm just curious if you notice, Daniel, that which of these two hurdles are the biggest in order to expand self-driving?
I would say that I think both are challenges. And I would actually add another one around public acceptance. But I would say fundamentally, it's a technical challenge, right? So I would say that in some ways, it's one of the biggest technology challenges of our generation. You mentioned weather, like just thinking about the long tail events and solving both for those as well as for the common events, I think is definitely a technical challenge. And being able to take the right and safe incremental steps for us to build out that product, I think is one of the core challenges for us. In terms of the regulatory side, I think it is true that there is a patchwork of regulatory, both from a state and country level. But I think we've taken a very collaborative approach with federal, state, and local regulators. We feel like that's the best way for us to move forward and safely test self-driving technology. So I think we've had great partnerships and great relationships there. But I would highlight that I do think public acceptance is another one, right? Like that with any new technology, there's always going to be questions and concerns. And we understand that this is a very new technology. But we believe strongly in that mission, right? The 1.3 million lives that are lost every single year due to car crashes. And so we're moving that forward, but we partner with nonprofits and other folks to get the word out, to explain both the technology and the benefits of the technology.
And what is have you noticed among the drivers in Phoenix or the riders in Phoenix that they have sort of an interest in helping accelerate this public acceptance, or that they're, have a particular investment into advancing this technology or being part of a driverless revolution?
Absolutely. I really do see our early riders and all of our riders as being really passionate about our mission. You see that in their comments, their feedback, their engagement. Many of them are real super users. They use the service a lot. And so I do think they see that not just as a service for themselves, but as being able to contribute and give back. And we take their comments and their feedback really seriously. So I think it's a great partnership from that perspective. But I agree with you that they definitely are really passionate and are mission driven in terms of their engagement with us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of some of the safety issues that come with having drivers on the road or people controlling these vehicles, another theme that's come up in recent months with the coronavirus is just that the safety issues of even sharing a car with a stranger or with a driver who you don't know in a taxi environment or in a ride-hailing environment. How has COVID accelerated or shifted Waymo's mission or your mission into offering this driverless taxi service?
I would say in one level, it hasn't changed our strategy at all, right? I think we've always felt building out the Waymo driver, our core technology, and applying it across use cases. Waymo One for transporting people and Waymo Via for transporting goods. But I would agree with your sense that I think it's only reinforced the benefits of self-driving technology. So I think that's definitely true, right? So in terms of overall changes, I think that's overall strategy hasn't changed. I think it just reinforces some of the benefits of this technology. I think overall it also has, just like it has for the entire world, been a challenging time for folks to navigate through. And we've also made changes in terms of the product itself to respond to the current environment. So, for instance, we've added features like there's a feature I really am passionate about around cabin air flush. So for between rides, we actually exchange the air. And so there's things like that we've adjusted in the product. I think our overall strategy hasn't really changed. But I agree with you that it's reinforced the value proposition of self-driving cars.
Okay, and we've got just a few minutes left in this call. What do you think is the most important thing for the public to know in order to accelerate their acceptance of this technology and increase their comfort when it comes to taking a taxi that doesn't actually have a driver in the seat?
Well, I think there's two halves to that, right? Like one, like the statistic I mentioned, I really do believe that we've become too comfortable with car crashes, right? And I know this is a weird thing to say, but over 1.3 million car crashes, right, a year. It's continuing in some ways over the last few years to increase. Those things I think we've almost got used to as a society. Like when you hear about, let's say, a car crash on the radio, you think more traffic, not a life lost. So maybe this feels like a roundabout way of answering your question, but I really worry that we've become too accustomed and acceptant that this is one of the top 10 causes of death on a global basis. So I think that's important to public acceptance, is you have to understand this is a problem, and you have to feel that problem. I think the second half is around understanding around how making sure that all of us in the industry are really being diligent about how we're stewards of the roads and making sure that we're being really safe. So here at Waymo, right, we've driven over 20 million miles in self-driving mode, over 15 billion miles in simulation. We test all the code on closed courses and with driver operators as well before it goes driverless. And so I think that's the other part, is showing the responsibility of us as an industry and as a company, that safety is really at the core of everything that we do. So I think those are the two halves that are critical for public acceptance, is understanding there is a core problem and feeling that, and then two, seeing and understanding the responsibility that all the companies have, but Waymo really embraces.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for taking us into this world, Daniel, and explaining about how Waymo is charting this driverless taxi future. Very exciting stuff. Definitely agree with you on how a lot of us are just very comfortable with the idea of car crashes and that this is an everyday thing, but maybe in the future this can be rectified and addressed. And next, we have Caroline Sampanero, who's the head of transit and micromobility policy at Lyft. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
And now we have Caroline Sampanaro, who is the head of transit and micromobility policy at Lyft. And it's a particularly lively time in micromobility because I understand that the coronavirus has led to a transformation in how we get around. So in urban areas, fewer people are taking public transit, and then elsewhere in the country, there's been quite a decline in new car purchases. And Caroline, I understand that in New York City, Lyft actually saw a record number of usage of the bike share program, City Bike, in September, hitting 2.5 million rides. What's driving all that?
Thanks, Rachel. So great to be here. I think the silver lining of a terrible period of time that we've all been in as Americans and around the world is that people are really being challenged, forced, inspired to try a new way of going about their day-to-day routine and even changing that routine. So in New York City, for example, as you mentioned, we broke the monthly ridership record, the daily ridership record on our city bike system. And I think that's because, New York City was opening up streets to people getting around on foot, on bike. Restaurants have moved dining outdoors. New Yorkers in general, like residents of cities around the world, are craving sort of proximity to people and things that they love to do. And a bicycle is a really magical way to connect with your city, to be near people, but not too close to people. And so I think that's why we're seeing that demand. It's such a sort of unexpected time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know I've actually been biking around the city more this summer than I was last summer for sure. And I think all those sort of factors you mentioned are driving that. And you mentioned the idea of just the way that cities are being designed is changing. So we're seeing more open streets, restaurants actually in the street, certain blocks that are just totally closed off to car traffic. How permanent do you think that is? And how do you think that will shape urban policy and urban planning going forward?
Yeah, I really think this is one of the more important crossroads moments that we've faced in terms of transportation. But transportation, as you know, is so cross-cutting across many, many issues. We have the status quo we could go back to, which is, cities built around single occupancy vehicles. In the US, there are 8 parking spots for every vehicle. By and large, our streets and cities have been turned over to the single occupancy vehicle. And COVID has, as you mentioned, inspired city agencies, communities to act fast, to open up streets to people. And, when we think about where we go from here, of course, we hope we get back to some routine that is somewhat normal, but we don't have to leave behind the great things that we've done, the creative things that we've done. And in fact, I think we're seeing people across the country in all types of cities choosing two-wheeled transportation in record numbers because they suddenly have had sort of permission to do so because governments have opened up the streets for that use to be easier, safer, more accessible. So I do think we're going to see these creative temporary ideas become more permanent. And in fact, I think we're seeing cities start to do that already. From San Francisco and Oakland to Minneapolis to Chicago. New York City and, smaller cities in between. I think, finally urban planners of all stripes have permission, I think, to take ideas that were maybe a little outside the box and make them more mainstream so that we can help people living in cities adapt to the new normal, and also, frankly, address massive challenges around environmental issues that we must face. And if the crossroads doesn't go the direction of streets for people, more people choosing micromobility, transit recovering, I think we face a bigger crisis. We face people flocking back to single occupancy vehicles in record numbers, which leads to congestion and all of the terrible health disparities that come with it. And frankly, there's something so much better. And so I do agree that, we're headed in that direction. And now it's just about sort of staying on that path.
And speaking of people flocking towards single occupancy vehicles, we've seen maybe more anecdotal stories about people, especially in New York, starting to actually buy cars for the first time. What do you make of that, and what should be the next steps in order to encourage people to look to two-wheeled alternatives, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think in transportation, there is a simple saying, is if you build it, they will come. And we've seen over a century that we have built infrastructure around single occupancy vehicle ownership, and people have driven. They've built their lives around their private automobile. And, what has happened over the last decade plus is that policies, companies like Lyft, have come to the table to make it easier for people not to have to make that choice, and for us to move in the direction of a shared transportation economy that actually facilitates happier lifestyles, more affordable lifestyles, and really brings out the best of cities. And, we've had a really interesting experience during COVID as well, partnering with transit agencies across the country. Transit is really the lifeblood of our cities. And as transit faces massive challenges related to the pandemic and ridership, Lyft has really been able to come in and provide resiliency and redundancy to the core programs of bus, rail, and subway systems by providing, easy, low cost shared rides for people, whether it's late night rides or rides along routes that have temporarily been suspended because of COVID. And I think that's another really unexpected way that a partner like Lyft has been able to show up for cities and for city residents and make sure that transit keeps going, and that we keep moving in the same direction we've wanted to move for the decade plus. Investing in non-driving is a really important part of the health of cities for the future.
Okay. And then speaking of other cities that are probably more dependent on cars and that highway system, Lyft has programs in cities like Columbus or Minneapolis, and I'm from the Detroit area, where of course cars are incredibly important to the economy and getting around, and of course that was encouraged by the infrastructure and the city planning there. But how do you see COVID and the transportation and transit developments and revolutions that it brought, how do you see that affecting those cities that are mostly still car-based?
I mean, I think all types of cities, whether they're small, more rural, are trying hard to figure out how to complement the single occupancy vehicle with other solutions. And so I agree with you, it's not a one size fits all, and you cannot sort of replicate New York City in cities all over the country or even the world. It's a unique place, but I do think that there are sort of standards that we can carry across all types of cities. Like, are there sidewalks in your community? Do you have access to some semblance of public transportation that you can complement with your personal car? I think that the sort of health of the country really depends on us thinking about transportation more broadly than the personal vehicle. And I think that isn't unique to just big cities. I think that can take different shapes, different forms. And it starts with how we design the street. Do we think about the street as a place that all types of people can travel safely? Do we make space on the street for buses as much as we do a single occupancy vehicle? And I think we're starting to see the answer to that question be yes. So that's, again, a positive trend. And it's not about leaving the vehicle behind. It's about creating some balance and making sure that people have options and how to get around.
Yeah, it is fascinating when I go back to Michigan, the amount, how rare sidewalks are in some suburbs. It's just impossible just to get around by foot. But of course, people are taking walks now for health and just to get outside. So I think we're definitely going to start seeing more movement towards that. Well, we're just about out of time. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us how the coronavirus is changing how we get around and having these permanent shifts potentially in commuter and transit patterns. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Daniel and Caroline for taking the time to speak with us today. Hearing about Waymo moving through the product work that has to underscore its technological achievements is super interesting right now. I spent the last couple of years working on a book about the history of the race to create the self-driving car, really delving into the early years of Waymo when it was Google's self-driving car product. The book is called Driven and comes out in January. And after doing all of those interviews, I feel pretty confident that no one in the early days of that program thought that cabin air flush would be an interesting idea that they would have to build into their vehicles to make them work the way they need to work today. And from Caroline, I love that idea of giving people permission and the means to get out of their cars and get around on two wheels or on scooters, on bicycles, or however else they like to do it, partly because it's a solution that I think solves all three of those problems that I talked about in my introduction, not just the pandemic and the need for people to get around in new ways, but also a changing climate that puts new emphasis on cutting back on carbon emissions, and also just increasingly crowded cities that are going to demand that we can't all just be in personal cars. And I think that's especially important since we saw from the earlier poll that this group puts a lot of value on improving infrastructure. Hopefully we made clear today that that's not just fixing potholes and repainting highway lines, but it's putting support into our cities and the rest of the country and the rest of the world for finding new ways to get around. And we learned from our first panel this morning that it's not just, even if we don't drive so much, even if we don't drive back to work, it hardly means we'll stop moving, especially as the pandemic starts to roll back, hopefully over the coming months, maybe over the coming year. Well, in any case, for those of you who didn't catch all of today's event or want to share it with friends and colleagues, it will be available to watch on demand. Thank you again to Arity for all of their support and collaboration on this event. Thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks to my colleague, Rachel. Thank you to the audience for joining us and the entire Business Insider team behind the scenes. Hopefully next year we can do this in person. Until then, stay safe and travel safe. Thanks.
I could try get your number, be a friend undercover, but you laugh when I'm trying to stay cool. I was never looking for love until I met you. I was just a walker right through. Everyone was staring at you. I always wish that I could say hi.